For 9 years, I was the daughter who stayed. My sister was the daughter who did not. I built an entire private religion on that one fact, and I worshipped at it every single day. And it took a wooden box of recipe cards to finally tear the church down. My name is Carol. I'm 49 years old, and I have carried the mail in Galena, Illinois, for almost 26 of those years. The same town where I was born, the same town where my mother lived her whole life, and, this past October, ended it. I know every porch and every dog, and every loose front step on my route. I am a person who stays. I have always been a person who stays, and for most of my life, I considered that a virtue, plain and simple, and I considered its opposite a plain and simple failing. This is the story of how I learned that I had been reading both of those things, my sister and myself, almost completely wrong. My mother's name was Eileen. She began to fail when she was 71. It started small, the way it so often does. A forgotten pot, a missed turn on a road she had driven for 50 years. And it did not finish with her until she was 80. 9 years. 9 years of a slow road downhill, and that road is the center of everything I'm going to tell you. So let me describe to you who walked it. I walked it. I want to say that without any false modesty, because it is simply the fact. I was the one who walked that road with my mother, every step, for 9 years. I lived 20 minutes from her house. I had the key. And as she declined, I became, by degrees, so gradual, I never once chose them. Her whole infrastructure. I did the groceries, and then I did the cooking. I sorted the pills into the days of the week box, and then I sat with her while she took them. I learned the names of her medications, and then I learned the names of her doctors, and then I learned the particular sound the house made at 3 in the morning when she had gotten up and become frightened and forgotten why. I gave 9 years of my life to my mother's long ending. I do not say that to be thanked. I say it because it is the load-bearing wall of this story, and you need to see how heavy it actually was before I tell you the rest. Let me make the weight real for you, because caregiving is a clean word, and there was nothing clean about it. It was 9 years of small indignities, hers and mine, and you learn to do them without flinching, and the not flinching costs you something you do not get an itemized bill for. It was learning to lift a grown woman who had once lifted me. It was the year she could still mostly manage and only needed checking on, and then the year she needed the checking to be twice a day, and then the year I gave up my own bed more nights than I slept in it. It was sitting in the long fluorescent afternoons of hospital waiting rooms. It was the slow, particular grief of being forgotten by a person while she is still alive to forget you. The morning my mother looked at me with perfect pleasant courtesy and asked me, kindly, whose daughter I was. I did not break down. I answered her, and I made the tea. You learn to keep moving. But every one of those 9 years took something out of me that it did not give back, and I felt myself, across that decade, becoming a smaller and a harder and a more tired woman, and I had nowhere at all to set any of it down. So I will tell you where I set it. I set it on my sister, and my sister did not. Her name is Janet. She is 4 years younger than me, and a very long time ago, in her early 20s, Janet moved away. She went to Arizona, 1,000 miles and most of a continent from Galena, and she built her life out there, and she stayed out there. And through all 9 years of our mother's decline, Janet came home a total of 4 times. 4 times, in 9 years. She called. I will be fair, she called often. She called every Sunday. But a telephone call does not sort a pillbox. A telephone call does not change a bed. Janet's voice came down the line every Sunday, warm and concerned, and asking good questions. And then, every Monday, I got back up and carried the actual weight of it, alone. And that arrangement held, week after week, for 9 years. You can guess, I think, what 9 years of that does to a heart. It builds something. It builds a hard, quiet, private structure inside you, and I tended mine carefully. I had a whole story about my sister, and I told it to myself constantly, and the story was very simple. Janet was selfish. Janet had looked at our mother's long, hard, unglamorous decline, and she had decided that it was my problem and not hers, and she had stayed comfortably in the Arizona sunshine and let her older sister be ground down to powder. That was the story. I never said it to her face. We are not, in our family, a face-to-face sort of people. But I said it to myself daily, and I said it, over the years, to my husband, and to a cousin or two, and to the mirror. The sister who stayed, and the sister who ran. I knew exactly which one of us I was, and I knew exactly what that made me, and I knew exactly what it made her. I want to be honest about what that did to me, the religion, because it did not only hurt Janet. A grievance that you feed every day for 9 years does not stay a small thing kept quietly in a drawer. It grows, and it needs more and more of you to sustain it, and it changes the taste of everything. There were good moments with my mother in those years. There were real ones, a handheld, a song she still somehow knew all the words to. And I let my resentment of my sister leak into even those, because some bitter accountant inside me was always running the tape, always noting that Janet was not there to see this either, always converting my mother's sweetness into fresh evidence for the case against my sister. That is what an unexamined grievance does. It is not a wound you are simply waiting out. It is a tenant, and it does not pay any rent, and it slowly rearranges all the furniture in the house to suit itself. By the end of the 9 years, I did not really have a sister anymore. I had a defendant. I had a person I had tried so thoroughly and so often in the private courtroom of my own head that I had quite forgotten she was also, somewhere 1,000 miles away, an actual living woman, with a life I could not see, and a story of her own that I had simply never once thought to ask to hear. My mother died on a Tuesday morning in October, at home, with me beside the bed. It was quiet, and it was not frightening, and after 9 years, I will tell you honestly that under the grief, there was also a thing I was ashamed to find, and the thing was relief. The road was over. I had walked my mother all the way to the end of it, and I had done it well, and now it was finished. Janet flew in for the funeral. She stayed 4 days. We were polite to each other. We are always polite, my sister and I. Politeness is the thin, clean cloth we keep spread over everything we have never said. And she cried at the service. Real tears, and some hard, cold part of me, even there, even at our own mother's funeral, sat back and watched my sister cry and thought, easy enough to cry for 4 days? Try 9 years. That is the kind of thought a person has when she has spent nearly a decade building a religion out of her own grievance. I am not proud of it, but I promised you the truth, and that was in me, at the funeral, and you should know it was there. Those 4 days that Janet was home were their own quiet misery, and I made them so. I watched her the entire time, the way a creditor watches a debtor. When she offered to help me with the arrangements, I heard, underneath her offer, 4 days against my 9 years, and I let a coolness into my voice that I told myself was grief, and knew, even then, was not. She tried once, on the second evening, to talk to me. Really talk, the kitchen table kind. And I felt it coming, and I got up and found something to do with the dishes, because the thin, clean cloth of politeness was the only surface I knew how to meet my sister on, and I was not about to lift it now. So we folded our mother's tablecloths together and spoke about the weather in Arizona. We were 2 women who had just lost their mother and badly, badly needed each other, and we stood 3 feet apart in our childhood kitchen and could not reach across it, because I was holding the whole of that distance open on purpose. I let my sister get back on a plane. I let her fly 1,000 miles away, with everything still unsaid, and I felt, watching her go, a grim and ugly little satisfaction, the satisfaction of a verdict upheld. That was the last thing I felt about Janet before the recipe box. I want you to have it, so that you can measure the size of the turn. Then Janet flew back to Arizona, and the house, my mother's house, the house we had both grown up in, became mine to empty. And that is where I want to slow down, because everything turns here. I had been dreading the house, not the work of it. I am not afraid of work. I was dreading the feeling of it. But when I actually began, I found it was something else. It was 9 years of my own life, shelved and stacked and folded into a single building, and I moved through it slowly, room by room, and I was, in a strange way, almost peaceful, until I got to the kitchen, until I got to the recipe box. You would have to have known my mother's kitchen to understand the recipe box. It was a wooden box, about the size of a loaf of bread, dark with 60 years of handling, and it had sat on the same kitchen counter my entire life. Inside it were recipe cards, hundreds of them, in my mother's small upright hand, some of them so old the ink had gone brown. And that box was, in our family, a kind of holy object. It was how my mother fed us. It was how she fed the whole street, frankly. Half the casseroles in Galena had come out of that box. I lifted it down off the counter that afternoon, fully expecting it to simply break my heart in the ordinary way. And I sat down at the kitchen table, and I began to go through the cards. And for the first while, that is exactly what it did. There was her chicken and dumplings. There was the lemon cake she made every Easter. I read her handwriting, and I cried the ordinary good tears, and I might have stopped there and packed the box and never known, except that about halfway down, the cards changed. They were still recipe cards. The same box, the same brown ink, the same upright hand. But these cards were not recipes. My mother, at some point in her last years, had begun using the cards in the box for something else. She had begun, on the backs of them and on fresh ones tucked between them, to write things down. Notes. Small dated notes. A kind of diary, kept in the one place in that house she knew was entirely, privately hers. Because who else, she must have thought, would ever go looking for a woman's secrets inside her recipe box? I want to tell you that I read them slowly, with care. I did not. I sat at that table as the light went down, and I read every card in that box, and the floor of my life quietly came apart while I did it. Because the notes were about Janet, not all of them, but card after card, across years, my mother had been keeping a record of my sister, and the record did not say what 9 years had taught me it would say. The first one that stopped me was small and dated from early on, and it said, in my mother's hand, "Spoke to Janet today. Did not tell Carol she calls me every evening too, not only Sundays. Carol has enough on her. Let her keep thinking it is just Sundays, every evening, not Sundays." Every evening, for 9 years, my sister had been calling our mother, and our mother had hidden that from me, on purpose, tucked it into a recipe box, because she had decided that I was already caring enough and did not need to know there was a whole second channel of care running quietly underneath the one I could see. I kept reading. The cards got worse, and by worse I mean truer, and by truer I mean that each one took another wall of my private religion down. There was a card about money. My mother had written that Janet sent money every single month, not now and then, every month, and had begged our mother never to tell me, because Janet knew, the card said, that Carol would not take help if she knew it had Janet's name on it. Carol's pride. So my mother had simply absorbed the money into the household quietly, the doctor's bills and the medicines, and the things I had assumed, for 9 years, we were just somehow scraping to afford. I had spent 9 years believing my sister contributed nothing. My sister had been paying for the medicine I was so proud of administering. There was a card about the 4 visits. The 4 times in 9 years that Janet did manage to come home. The 4 visits I had always counted out like a prosecutor laying coins on a table. My mother had written about one of them. She had written, "Janet came for 3 days. Cried in the kitchen the night before she left, because she has to go back and cannot say why. She thinks she is failing me. I could not make her believe that she is not. My daughter flies all this way and spends the whole visit drowning in a guilt I would lift off her in 1 second if she would only let me." I read that card, and I had to set it face down on the table for a while, because I had been at one of those visits. I remembered Janet, on the last evening of one of her trips, going quiet and strange and leaving the room, and I remembered exactly what I had thought, watching her go. I had thought, she cannot even get through 3 days. I had taken my sister, sitting alone in a back bedroom, weeping with guilt at not being able to stay, and I had filed it neatly away as proof of how little she cared. There is no version of the truth, it turns out, that the right verdict cannot find a way to misread. And then there was the card that I have not been able to put down since. It was dated about 4 years into our mother's decline, and it was longer than the others. And my mother had written, "Janet cannot come home, and it is breaking her. She still will not let me tell Carol the reason. I think she would rather Carol believe she is selfish than have Carol know the truth. I have never in my life been prouder of either of my girls than I am of the one who is letting her sister hate her in order to protect her." I sat in my mother's kitchen in the dark, and I read that sentence perhaps 20 times. Letting her sister hate her in order to protect her. There was a reason. There had been a reason the whole time, for 9 years. A real reason my sister could not come home. And my sister had chosen, deliberately, to let me think the worst of her rather than tell me what it was. I called Janet that night. It was late, and I did not care. And when she answered, frightened by the hour, I did not know how to begin. So I simply read her the cards. I read my dead mother's handwriting to my sister down a telephone line, all the way across the country. And on the other end, I heard my sister, who I had spent 9 years believing did not feel things deeply enough, begin to cry in a way I had never once heard from her. We did not say very much for a while. I sat at my mother's kitchen table, with the cards spread out in front of me, and the telephone against my ear. And 1,000 miles away, my sister cried. And I listened to her cry, and I found that I was crying too. And that for the first time in 9 years, the two of us were doing the same thing, at the same time, in the very same minute, instead of each performing our separate griefs in our separate locked rooms. When Janet could speak again, the first thing she said was not an explanation. The first thing she said was, "I'm so sorry, Carol." And I told her to stop, because I could not stand to hear my sister apologize to me. My sister, who had paid the doctors, who had telephoned our mother every single evening for 9 years, who had let me hate her on purpose. I could not stand to hear that woman say sorry to me down a telephone line. I said, "Janet, I have spent 9 years getting you completely wrong, and I need you to just talk to me now, and I am not going to interrupt, and I am not going to judge a single word of it." And there was a long breath on the other end of the line. And then my sister, who had carried this entirely alone for 9 years, finally set it down. And then, finally, because there was no longer any wall left for it to hide behind, Janet told me the reason. I'm not going to lay out every private piece of it here, because it is hers, and she has carried it quietly for long enough without me handing it around. But I will tell you the shape of it, because the shape is the whole point. My sister had not stayed away from our mother out of selfishness. My sister had stayed in Arizona because there was a person in Arizona who depended on her, completely, and could not be moved and could not be left. A person whose care had landed on Janet, the way our mother's care had landed on me, suddenly and totally, and without anyone choosing it. For 9 years, while I was nursing our mother in Illinois, my sister had been doing the exact same work, the exact same sleepless, grinding, invisible work, for someone else, 1,000 miles away. We had not been one sister who carried the family and one sister who ran from it. We had been two sisters, each one holding up a different falling roof, each one with no hand left over, and neither of us had known the other one was doing it. And Janet had hidden hers. That was the part I could barely hold. Janet had decided, early on, that if I knew she was already buried under one person's care, I would feel I could not ask her for any help with our mother, and that the guilt of that, the guilt of being unable to come, would crush me along with everything else I was carrying. So she had made a choice. She had chosen to let me believe she was simply a selfish woman who would not come home. She had taken my contempt, 9 years of it, my cold voice at the funeral, all of it, and she had absorbed it on purpose, as a shield, so that I would never have to feel the particular pain of knowing my sister wanted desperately to help me and could not. She let me hate her because she had decided my hatred was lighter for me to carry than the truth. I have turned that choice of hers over and over, and I want to be careful about how I land on it, because it is the most complicated thing in this whole story. Part of me is in awe of it. To love your sister so much that you would deliberately let her think you a coward and a deserter, that you would absorb a decade of her contempt, rather than add 1 single ounce to a load you could see was already too heavy. There is a strange and enormous generosity in that, and I do not want to pretend that there is not. But part of me is also, even now, a little angry, and Janet and I have said this plainly to each other since, because it was not really hers to decide. She looked at me, from 1,000 miles away, and she decided, alone, without consulting me, without giving me any vote at all, what my heart could and could not bear. She decided that I was too fragile for the truth. And in doing that, however much love was in it, she took something from me. She took my chance to truly know my own sister and to stand alongside her, instead of against her, for 9 of the hardest years that either of us will ever live. Love made the choice. But love does not always make the choice correctly, and a kindness that has to be built out of a lie will, sooner or later, cost far more than the truth ever would have. I have thought, since that night, about my mother in her kitchen with that box. Because my mother knew. My mother knew both halves of it, knew what I was carrying and knew what Janet was carrying, and she made a decision too. She decided she could not break either of her daughter's confidences, not while she lived. Janet had asked her not to tell me, and she would not. But she also could not bear, I think, the thought of leaving this earth and letting her 2 girls go on forever in the wreckage of a misunderstanding she had watched the whole of. So she did the only thing a woman that loyal and that clever could do. She wrote it all down, the truth of both her daughters, and she put it in the one box she knew I would have to open after she was gone. She could not tell me while she breathed, so she made very sure I would find out the moment she stopped. Janet and I have talked more in these last weeks than we have in 20 years. Real talking. Not the thin, clean cloth of politeness, but the thing underneath it that we had both been protecting and starving in equal measure. I have apologized. I have apologized for the religion I built, for the version of her I carried and showed to cousins, for the cold thought at the funeral that she did not know I had had, and that I made myself confess anyway, because a real apology does not get to keep its most shameful part hidden. And Janet has apologized too, for the hiding, for deciding alone what I could and could not bear, for taking a choice about my own heart out of my hands for 9 years, however much love she did it with. We have agreed on something, she and I. We have agreed that we are done protecting each other by lying to each other. It turns out that is not protection at all. It only feels like protection. What it actually is 2 people each carrying a crushing weight in a separate locked room, 10 feet apart, each one believing she is completely alone, when the truth, the whole maddening truth, was that if either of us had simply opened her door, we would have found a sister standing right there, holding up her own ceiling, who understood exactly. Janet flew back to Galena 6 weeks after the funeral, not for a service this time, not for any occasion at all, just to come and sit in our mother's emptying house with me, which is a thing she had not done, simply for its own sake, in more than 20 years. We spent 4 days together, and they were nothing at all like the 4 days of the funeral. We went through the house slowly, the 2 of us, and we let ourselves cry in front of each other, and we told each other the real shapes of our 2 separate decades, the things, the sleepless, particular things, that only the other one in all the world could fully understand, because she had been doing the identical work in another room of the country the entire time. I had spent 9 years certain that I was the only person alive who knew what that load truly felt like. It turned out that my own sister had been carrying its exact twin, and that if I had only opened the door between us, I would have found, my whole life long, the one person who never needed any of it explained. We are not going to get those years back. I want to be honest about that, the way our mother was always honest. There is no door we can open now onto 1999, or 2010, or any of the Christmases we spent resenting each other across a continent. But we have the years that we have left. And we have agreed, my sister and I, to spend them on the same side of the wall. I still have the recipe box. I have not packed it away with the rest. It sits on my kitchen counter now, the way it sat on my mother's for 60 years, and the casserole recipes still work, and I still make the lemon cake at Easter. But it is not the recipes that I open it for anymore. Every so often, I take out the card that says I have never been prouder of either of my girls, and I read my mother's handwriting, and I think about how she fed this whole town for 60 years out of that box, and how, right at the end, with the last of her strength, she used it to feed the two of us one more time. She used it to feed us the truth. It was the most important thing she ever cooked. If you have a sibling you have quietly judged, a brother or a sister who was not in the room when the hard thing happened, and whom you have privately convicted for it, then this story was for you. One word in the comments, if it found you. Recipe. Just that. It tells me you understand now that you may not have the whole of the story, and that it might be time, while you still can, to go and ask. Subscribe for new stories, real patterns, full narratives, the long game. Two small pieces of wisdom from this one, before I go. The first, when a family hits its hardest season, there is almost always one person who is visibly carrying it. And it is terribly easy, when you are that person, to look at whoever is not in the room and build a hard little verdict about them. I did it for 9 years. So hear this from someone who got it as wrong as it is possible to get it. You are seeing one half of the picture, the half that is in front of you, and you're filling in the other half with the worst paint you have. The person who is absent is not necessarily absent because they do not care. Sometimes they are absent because they are pinned, somewhere you cannot see, under a weight every bit as heavy as your own. Be slow to convict the one who is not in the room. You almost never have the whole file. The second, if you are protecting someone you love by hiding your own burden from them, by letting them think less of you rather than letting them worry about you, please reconsider it. I know it feels like love. My sister did it out of pure love, and it cost us 20 years we will not get back. When you decide, alone, what another person is strong enough to know, you are not sparing them. You are only making very sure that the two of you carry your separate weights alone, when you might have carried them so much more lightly, side by side. We rarely know the whole of what another person was carrying, so be slow, very slow, to send the bill. I'll see you next time.